Hi, I'm Alana Hippensteel from Pharmacy Times. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Clive Ward-Abel, the president of Clintel and a trained pharmacist and physician who has worked in the pharmacy industry for over 30 years. Dr. Ward-Abel is here to discuss research investigating the use of psychedelic compounds to treat obesity as well as optimize human health. What have the results, if just diving into a little bit, found to date on the specific use of these compounds in the treatment of obesity in terms of things have been responding quite positively. Could you dive into a little bit more about how and some details?
As I mentioned, there hasn't been any clinical studies in
Okay.
obesity, but there have been tantalizing signals from other studies where they've used psilocybin or other psychedelics in the treatment of depression or PTSD, or for the treatment of alcohol addiction, or even tobacco smoking cessation. Whereas, as I mentioned, there, even though it was not a primary endpoint or even a secondary endpoint, they did ask patients afterwards, and they spontaneously mentioned that up to 60% of those had an improvement in diet,
Right.
as well as the exercise increase.
Okay.
And on top of that, the sense of well-being, of just feeling that much more positive, being more, they just feel they have better relationships with people, feel better about themselves, their perspectives about themselves, their body image, and all that seems to be improved. So that all gives us, as I say, tantalizing signals that this is going to work when we do it specifically targeted towards obesity and the potential triggers that lead to the negative behaviors within the obesity population.
Right. Right. It's fascinating. Does your team have a sense of a timeline on when a potential obesity treatment could be available using a psychedelic compound um, on into the future? It sounds like it may still be, you know, relatively far in the future, but do you have a sense of what that might look like?
Yeah, and this is at this stage, it's speculative because we are still just going into the clinic for the first time. So our proof of concept study, we're targeting that we should be having first patient in the first quarter of next year.
Okay.
So that proof of concept study, that'll teach us a ton
Right.
about what, who the right patient is, how to do that, etc. But ultimately having it on available and commercially available, put it that way, for patients in clinics, we're looking at probably within a 5-year time frame.
Okay. Um, and upon FDA approval, would this treatment only be available in states that have legalized the use of certain psychedelics for medical purposes? And if so,
So,
uh,
yeah, go on, sorry.
yeah, sorry.
So actually, thank you for asking that question, because this is a very important point. The use of these psychedelics and the way it's been researched now is very separate to the recreational use and the legalization in certain states or countries. So the way we expect this to be regulated would be very much similar to any other pharmacological agent.
Okay.
All right, it's going to have to go through this regulatory approvals. It's going to have to show the studies that are, that allow you to go for a specific indication. The treatment of patients is going to be in a very controlled clinical fashion in clinics. This is not something that you do at home. Don't try that kind of thing. This is not, it's going to be very important for all researchers within the space right now to make sure that this is not connected to recreational use.
Right.
All right.
That makes sense. Yeah. Um, and so for that reason, there aren't the same legalization issues. So regardless of the
Yeah.
states that have legalized, this would be FDA approved and not subject to the same laws. Is that, well, because it would have already processed through the government in that regard?
Yes, the way I foresee it, and we've got to go down that path, is yes, you would be able to buy your psilocybin. Well, not the patient won't be able. It will be prescribed by a physician,
Right.
which will be administered by another healthcare professional who is certified. They will have their psilocybin capsule, which will contain the psilocybin,
Mhm.
and then um, and then go through the whole, as it's called, the drug enhanced psychotherapy protocol.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so um, it's very similar to what's being done now with ketamine.
Okay.
Ketamine's been approved
Yeah.
for treatment-resistant depression.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. So has the lack of full legalization of a broad spectrum of psychedelic compounds caused any limitations to the potential for research either on your team or outside of your team?
Well, historically, yes, it has been.
Okay.
Basically, it was all shut down completely. I mean, the 1980s and early 90s there was very little research that was being able to be done
Okay.
on a legal basis. But I think moving forward, I think both FDA and Health Canada are much more open to the possibility now of um, approving or looking at assessing a psychedelic in these treatments. But as I said, it has to be in a very clinical, well researched uh, and supported studies that have to be done. So, like any other pharmaceutical, this is the way it will be regulated. So,
Right.
there are a few extra little hurdles, but then to me, they're not going to be onerous
Okay.
to get over. And but that should be fine. I don't see much problem from a regulatory perspective.
Right. Interesting. Do you think there would be any medical benefit to the legalization of certain psychedelic compounds that are currently illegal due to their historical association with problematic patterns of recreational use?
As I mentioned earlier, this is to me, this should have nothing to do with the recreational
Okay.
use. You know, there's a lot of drugs that are on the market right now that are used recreationally. Think of the benzodiazepines, etc.
Sure.
You know, so I think this will go in the same path as that from a pharmaceutical and the way the regulatory agencies will actually look at this.
Yeah.
I cannot comment on whether legalization of these is going to be beneficial to as a whole, to the population.
Okay. Sure. Sure. That makes sense. What is your outlook on the future of the psychedelic medicine landscape?
As I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, this is such an exciting field. It's it is so interesting that I actually think this is going to be it potentially could be one of the biggest paradigm shifts in the treatment of psychological disorders
Yep.
for a long time.
Hmm.
Um, but I stress once again, this has to be done. The research of this has to be done in a really scientific, ethical manner,
Yeah.
and be treated as such. Um, for a and as I say, from the amount of research that's been done, as I say, PTSD, depression, existential crisis, distress, etc. Even the smaller studies in alcohol addiction, tobacco cessation, the effect sizes that have been seen are quite dramatic. I know a lot of them are small studies, and it's difficult to blind some of these, but those effect sizes is what you actually can get a good understanding or idea that these things actually will work. So now we have to really research and quantify that the best we can.
Yeah. I think that point around the separation between recreational and medical and trying to think of those separately in the same way, like you're saying, in regards to other currently FDA approved drugs being, there being patterns of abuse in recreational areas. So they are quite separate, and I think that's a really important point. And I think, this research that your team is doing into trying to understand the efficacy outside of potentially any, worries about that prior understanding around recreational use is really valuable to understanding how just the mind works more generally. So thank you. And thank you so much for taking this time to speak with me today, Dr. Ward Abel.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Elena. I really appreciate it as well. So